Night before my father's retirement dinner, the woman who cleaned our office building for 16 years stopped me in the parking garage and said, "Don't go in there tomorrow, not until you've listened to what I have to tell you." Her name was Evelyn. She'd worked the night shift at Hargrove and Merritt Financial since before I joined the company. She knew everyone's coffee order. She knew which partners left their shredding for last and which ones burned the midnight oil before a merger. She was the kind of person who existed in every office but whom almost no one truly saw. I saw her. I always had. "Evelyn," I said, "what's going on?" She looked over her shoulder. Her hands were still gripping her cleaning cart like it might roll away from her. "Not here," she said. "Come to my car." "My name is Cecily. I'm 31 years old, and at the time, I was the director of client relations at Hargrove and Merritt, a mid-size wealth management firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. My father had founded the company 22 years earlier with a man named Douglas Merritt, his college roommate and lifelong best friend. Together they had built something real: 43 employees, a client roster that included regional hospital networks, university endowments, 3 professional athletes, and a lot of old Charlotte money that didn't like to be talked about at dinner parties. My father was retiring at 64. Heart condition, doctor's orders. He'd spent 8 months transitioning responsibilities, and in 2 weeks, my brother-in-law Griffin was set to take over as managing partner. I had been told this was a family decision. I had been told it was about continuity. I had been told a lot of things. I followed Evelyn to her Camry in the lower level of the parking deck. She didn't waste time once the doors were shut. "Last Thursday," she said, "I was cleaning the fourth-floor conference room. The one with the frosted glass. I always start there around 9:30 because the partners are usually gone by then." She paused. They weren't gone. She had heard my father's voice and Griffin's. And Douglas Merritt's son, Carter, who had technically no role at the firm but who had been showing up to meetings for the past 3 months in a consultant capacity that no one had bothered explaining to me. What she described next took me about 10 seconds to understand and about 10 minutes to fully believe. They were restructuring the partnership agreement, not the one my father had announced publicly, a different one. One that routed Griffin's controlling interest through a holding entity registered in Delaware, Carter's holding entity, with a secondary provision that would dilute the shares currently under my name within 18 months of the transition. Not eliminate them. Just reduce them to the point of irrelevance. Below the threshold required to call a shareholder meeting, below the threshold required to request an audit, below the threshold required to ask questions anyone was obligated to answer. I sat in the passenger seat of Evelyn's Camry for a long time after she stopped talking. "How much did you hear?" I asked. "Enough," she said. "I heard your name more than once. I heard your father say, 'Cecily won't push back. She trusts the process.' And then I heard Griffin laugh. I had helped build that process. I had spent 4 years developing the client retention framework that now accounted for nearly a third of the firm's recurring revenue. I had negotiated the Whitmore University endowment contract personally, an account worth $2.3 million in annual fees, while Griffin was on a ski trip in Vail. I had covered 3 client emergencies during my mother's cancer treatment, including one that required me to drive to Greensboro at 11 at night to sit across from a very angry retired surgeon who was ready to pull his account. I had done all of that because I believed I was part of something. Because my father looked me in the eye at Christmas every year and said, "This will be yours too, Cecily. You know that, right?" Hero complex. I didn't know that was what they called it until Evelyn told me what she had heard. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it." I kept thinking maybe I misunderstood. But I'd been cleaning that floor for a long time. I know what restructuring language sounds like. My ex-husband was an accountant. I thanked her. Genuinely, properly thanked her. I wrote her name down in my phone so I wouldn't forget it in whatever came next. Then I drove home. I didn't cry on the way. I noticed that about myself. Something had just snapped into a different configuration, like a lock turning, and the part of me that would normally have been devastated was standing very still and very quiet behind whatever just took over. The retirement dinner was at a restaurant in Dilworth, the kind of place with exposed brick and a wine list that goes on longer than most novels. My mother had arranged it, 40 people, linen napkins, a slideshow of my father's career that I had helped compile 3 weeks ago. I sat at the table and smiled. I ate the duck, I clinked glasses. When my father stood up to give his remarks, I applauded. When Griffin put his arm around my sister and said how proud he was to carry the firm forward, I watched him and kept my expression exactly where it needed to be. I was raised in this family. I know how to smile at a table. What they didn't know was that I had spent the hours between Evelyn's parking garage and that dinner doing something very specific. I went home. I opened my laptop. And I read every document I had ever signed for that company. Not skimmed. Read, because here is what my father forgot, or chose not to think about, when he decided I would trust the process. I am the one who hired our current outside counsel. I am the one who insisted 3 years ago that the firm adopt the client consent provision requiring written authorization from the originating relationship manager before any account could be transferred to a new point of contact. I had pushed for it after we lost a client to a competitor because of a sloppy internal handoff. The partners had found it slightly tedious but agreed. That provision covered 29 of our top 40 accounts. 29 accounts that I had originated or co-originated. 29 accounts that could not be quietly absorbed into Griffin's new management structure without my written sign-off. I also found something else. In the original partnership agreement, the one from 2003, the founding document, there was a clause my father had apparently forgotten about or assumed no longer applied. It stated that any restructuring of equity interests exceeding 15% required written consent from all parties holding above a minimum threshold. My shares, even after the proposed dilution, would sit just above that threshold for the first 18 months. Just above it, which meant they needed my signature, which meant they had planned to get it. I thought about when, I thought about how. I thought about Griffin saying casually over Thanksgiving, "We're going to need you to sign off on some administrative updates to the partnership docs in the new year." Just housekeeping. I had nodded and passed the cranberry sauce. Housekeeping. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning with a yellow legal pad and a highlighter. By the time I went to bed, I had 4 pages of notes, 2 emails drafted but not sent, and a very clear picture of what was about to happen and what I was going to do instead. The transition was scheduled to formalize on a Monday. The Friday before, I called a meeting. I requested it through official channels, a written request to the partnership, which I was still entitled to do, and cited it as a routine client relations update. Conference room 4. 10 o'clock. Griffin showed up looking mildly annoyed. My father looked confused. Carter Merritt, who had no formal standing to attend, came anyway. My father's assistant hovered near the door. I brought one folder. I set it on the table and I did not open it immediately. "Before we begin," I said, "I want to ask one question." "And I'd like an honest answer," my father said. "Of course. Was the partnership restructuring that's being finalized on Monday disclosed to me in its complete form, including the Delaware holding entity and the provisions affecting my equity position in months 13 through 18? Silence. Griffin looked at my father. My father looked at his hands. Carter said, "Cecily, this is a complex transition, and there are a lot of moving parts." "That's not an answer," I said. My father looked up. He had the expression of a man who had just realized he was not, in fact, having the conversation he had prepared for. "We were going to walk you through everything," he said. "When?" He didn't answer. I opened the folder. Inside was a single document, a formal written notice under the client consent provision, which I had drafted with the help of an attorney friend the night before. It stated that pending my review and written authorization, the transfer of relationship management responsibilities for the 29 named accounts would be paused. It was not hostile. It was not accusatory. It was just the provision, cited correctly, applied appropriately. I slid it across the table. "I'm not signing anything related to the transition," I said, "until I receive full disclosure of the restructuring terms reviewed by independent counsel of my choosing. I'm also invoking the 15% consent clause in the original partnership agreement." Griffin's jaw tightened. "You're stalling a transition that the whole firm has been preparing for." "I'm exercising rights that exist in the founding document," I said. "If there's nothing irregular about the transition, disclosure shouldn't be a problem." Carter said, "This is going to delay everything." "Then let's not delay it," I said. "Full disclosure, full documents. Give me 2 weeks to review with my attorney. If everything is as routine as you've described it, I'll sign." I stood up. I want to be clear, I said, that I'm not here to blow anything up. I built a third of this firm's recurring revenue. I have no interest in hurting it, but I'm also not going to disappear into paperwork that was designed to erase me. I picked up my folder and walked out. The next 72 hours were something I will describe as organized chaos with good suits. Griffin called twice. I let both go to voicemail. My sister texted me 3 separate times, each message slightly more agitated than the last, the final one reading, "You are making this so much harder than it has to be." I did not respond. My father came to my apartment on Saturday evening. He stood in my doorway holding his car keys like he wasn't sure whether to leave them in his pocket or set them down. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," he said. "Which part?" I asked. He didn't have an answer for that either. What he said next, though, surprised me. He sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had spent Friday night with my legal pad, and he looked old in a way I hadn't seen before. Not frail, just tired, like something had been held up by effort for a long time, and the effort had finally stopped. "Griffin needed the control structure to secure the outside financing," he said. "There's a capital raise in the pipeline, institutional money. They wanted a clean authority chain. And I was a complication." He didn't deny it. "You could have told me," I said. "I thought you'd push back." "I am pushing back," I said. "The difference is that now I'm doing it with documents instead of feelings." He almost smiled. "Almost. I want to be honest about something. In the movies, this is the part where the wrong daughter delivers a perfect speech, and the father has a tearful realization, and everything is repaired. That is not what happened in my kitchen. What happened was quieter and stranger and more real than that. My father sat at my table and he said, 'I made a mistake. I convinced myself it was strategy. It wasn't. It was cowardice.' And I sat across from him, and I felt approximately 17 different things at once, and I didn't resolve any of them that night. What I said was, 'Then let's fix the documents.' The following Tuesday, I met with the firm's outside counsel alongside my own attorney, a woman named Jo who had gone to law school with my college roommate and had a talent for making grown men reconsider their choices in very calm language. The Delaware holding entity was restructured. The dilution provision was removed. My equity position was codified with explicit protections. In exchange, I agreed to a modified transition timeline and a formal co-director structure that gave Griffin the operational authority he needed for the capital raise, without routing it through a document that was quietly designed to sideline me. It took 9 days. It was not pleasant. There were 2 meetings where I had to excuse myself to the hallway and stand very still for a minute before going back in. But by the end of it, I had something I didn't have before. Not just the equity protection. Something harder to put in a contract. I want to tell you about Evelyn. On the day the revised partnership agreement was finalized, I drove to the office at 7:30 in the morning, before most people arrived. I brought a card and a gift card to the restaurant she had mentioned once during a conversation about her daughter's quinceañera, the Mexican place on Central Avenue she'd been saving up to take the family to. I found her finishing the 4th floor. I handed her the card. She read it and her eyes got a little bright and she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," I said. "Did it work out?" "Yes," I said, "it worked out." "Yes," I said, "it worked out." She nodded, folded the card carefully, and put it in the pocket of her vest. "Good," she said. "I wasn't going to be able to sleep right if it hadn't. I think about that a lot. A woman who owed me nothing, who could have kept her head down and her cart moving and left me to walk into a situation I didn't know I was walking into. She didn't. She sat in her Camry in a parking deck and told me the truth because she thought it was the right thing to do. The world runs on people like Evelyn. We just don't thank them enough. Griffin and I have a functional working relationship now. I would not call it warm. He runs operations. I lead client strategy. We have learned to be professional in the way that people learn to be professional when the alternative is worse for everyone. My sister and I are still finding our footing. She is not a bad person. She was protecting her husband, which I understand even when I don't excuse it. My father came back to the office for the formal signing. He shook my hand before he left, which was not something he and I had ever done before. It felt strange and right at the same time. He said, "You're going to be fine." I said, "I know." And here's what I didn't say, but what I had known since I sat in the passenger seat of Evelyn's Camry in the lower level of that parking deck. I had always been fine. The question was just whether the people around me were finally going to have to reckon with that. They didn't erase me from the firm I helped build. They tried to route around me like a detour around construction. What they didn't count on was that I had spent 4 years quietly becoming the road. I'm still here. My name is on the revised agreement in ink that doesn't disappear. And the next time someone at that table decides to have a conversation they assume I won't hear, they should remember that I once spent 30 minutes, very still and very quiet, learning everything I needed to know. I am always listening, and I am never just along for the ride.